We grew up in a household of five siblings, and Olivia being the oldest, me being the second oldest. Olivia was a beautiful person, inside and out. She was just very loving and caring. We're less than a year apart, so when I graduated, I moved out of my mom's house and moved with Olivia and her husband. My sister wanted to bring me under her wing, basically show me how to find a job.
I would always call her Fabulous Olivia. So this is probably one of those moments. She got the shades on, the drink, got her nails done, and the swimsuit. So this was just Olivia being fabulous. I know she was my sister-in-law, but I always say she was my sister because we talked about everything.
Olivia went into the tax business where she became very successful.
She was just always into something that was business-oriented.
This is when Olivia first became a mom. This is my sister Courtney. This is Olivia. This is my mother when she had short hair. And this is Ariel.
Mom looks so young. She looks so young. It was pretty cool growing up. We used to go camping a lot, going swimming, climbing trees and stuff like that. She always made sure that we had everything. Basically a kid's like fantasy.
The divorce with her and Al was very upsetting to her, very disappointing. I feel like it also made her insecure in areas. And she was still just trying to make sure that her and the girls were good.
She really had to start over. She definitely did want to meet someone new. She wanted to get that family aspect back.
She seemed reluctant, to kind of move forward. But, I told her, I say, hey, you got to put yourself out there. You need to date, have fun again.
I knew that she wanted to find someone that was actually going to love her and just be all for her.
When I first heard the news that Olivia had met someone, I welcomed it because I want to see her happy.
She always talked about how cute he was and he has a good job.
He worked for the state of Texas as a prison guard. You would think that as a prison guard, they would be some type of protector for their families, for sure. As long as I can remember, as a kid growing up, we used to have football Sundays where on a Sunday you come together, you come at somebody's house, and there's a lot of good food to eat and there's a lot of good football to watch.
Football Sundays at my in-laws. I had never seen anything like it until I married into this family. We would go straight after church and stay there until like 10 o'clock, sometimes later. Everybody will still be there, be a packed house.
Just a lot of good family time and got a lot of good family fun. And Olivia was the centerpiece of all of that.
First time I met Chris, I remember Miss Anita offering him, which is my mother-in-law, offering him some food. Olivia was sitting next to him. And he said, yeah, you can go fix me something to eat. He told Olivia to go and fix the food. And I just kind of brushed it off. I said, well, maybe he's just one of those guys, very old school.
The first time I met Christopher, his whole dynamic was just off to me. When you talk to him, he comes off as arrogant. He is a know-it-all. And he used to tell me all the time, like, oh, I'm gonna marry your mom and all this stuff. And yeah, I would be like, no, you're not. Like, no, you're not. And I would run and tell my mom, like, no, you're not gonna marry this man. Please don't marry this man.
Early on in their relationship, Olivia and Christopher Jones had went out to a local restaurant in Beaumont, Texas one night. There was a young lady that Christopher Jones had been dating before. He got upset and started an altercation with Olivia.
We just happened to be there, and I guess this was a first date for them. And then we see these girls just jumping Olivia. It was 3 of them, and she was by herself. And one took off her shoe and was hitting Olivia in the head with it. Yeah, one holding her, and the other one was just kind of fighting. Chris, and this is something I'll never forget, is not doing anything. I remember him laughing with his 2 friends.
At the time, the police was called, and of course, that's when Christopher Jones really tucks his tail and runs.
And I just remember Olivia getting in her Suburban at the time, and she was blood and was red and was crying a whole lot. And I remember trying to tell her, Olivia, calm down. And she was like, no, I want to go home. After the fight happened, I did contact Olivia. I said, you need to press charges.
But Chris told her to not file a police report because he was working at the prison at that time. So he didn't want it to come back on him. I never had a good feeling from Chris. Never. But she didn't see that.
Myself, my wife, and my kids, and Olivia and her children were at a local park here in Beaumont, Texas. We had been at the park playing and catching up. Noticed that my sister's phone kept ringing, but she would never answer it. And it would ring back to back to back, basically, and she would never pick up the phone. Olivia and her kids had got into her car, and all of a sudden we see a truck kind of fly into the parking lot.
And I was like, well, who is this? And then I see Chris jump out the truck, leave his door open, and I see him punching her glass window. Like, he kept punching it, and at this point, Josh, he sees what's going on.
When I seen him bamming on the window, I immediately started running up to the situation with my wife grabbing me, trying to hold me back.
And I just remember pulling my husband's shirt because I'm like, we got the kids right here, and I'm telling the kids, y'all stay right there. And then at the same time, I'm on the phone with 911. And I see Olivia crying and screaming, please stop, Chris, please stop.
I heard my Aunt Brittany say, I'm gonna call 911, I'm calling 911 right now. And that's when he jumped in his truck and he sped off. And I remember him speeding off because he turned the corner so fast it looked like the truck was gonna flip.
And at this point, my kids are hysterical. And I looked over and Yahlia and Ariel weren't crying. When I noticed that, I instantly said, oh, they've seen this before.
When I got up to the vehicle and Olivia was crying in the seat, and at that point, that's when Olivia shut down. And she didn't want to talk about it.
After that altercation, it did change our relationship with Olivia. She stopped talking to us for about a year.
Looking back at it, I should have pressed it more. He isolated her, made her feel like the only people that was there for her was his side of the family.
They didn't try to justify it. They just said that they were going to counseling, that he was getting better, and he would basically never do it again. Turn around. Ooh!
I believe when Olivia cut us off around that time, she was in love with Chris. She was embarrassed by what he had done. And I think she wanted everyone to believe that their relationship was good. They were in a good space. From the conversations we had with my mother-in-law, the family, you know, just thought Chris was just this really good guy. But me and Josh, my husband, we knew the truth, and we knew he had a dark side.
Lily, I'm a lady. I'm gonna protect you with my life. But only one way I can do it. You gotta be my wife.
Come on. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Come on, baby. Come on. Say yes.
I just remember seeing on social media that he proposed to her and they got engaged.
When she told us, I didn't have no words.
I think she considered, you know, this will make sure my girls are taken care of.
I didn't want him to be my stepdad, and I didn't want him in my life.
Olivia told me about Ariel having her reservations. And like I told her, you have to listen to your child. But she felt like it was because Ariel didn't want to see her move on with someone besides her dad.
As long as he made it seem like he was changing, that he was gonna make everything right, then she was gonna stick beside him. The Beauty and the Beast, but without the beast changing.
Deep down in my heart, I was very confused. I was wondering, what is it about this man that she's so drawn to? Why does she feel like him controlling her is love? And I was honestly very frightened for her and the girls. I was very afraid.
It was hell, basically. Chris definitely brought the prison to his house. He ran it like a prison. He oversaw it as a prison. So everything had to be done at a certain time, by a certain way. Rooms had to be clean at all times. We couldn't have literally anything on the floor. The beds had to be made. It couldn't have no wrinkles or anything in the comforter. Like, everything had to be straight, and like you had to literally take your hand and straighten out the blankets. Pillows had to be nice and neat. If we had the TV on, and if he didn't like what was on the TV, he'd either make us cut it off or he'd make us change it. If you weren't in the room during the day, the door had to be open. So that way, if anyone came down the hallway, they would see how nice and neat everything was. The dishes had to be done every night, washed. The floors had to be cleaned every night. The rugs had to be cleaned every night. And his number one rule was like, whatever happens in this house stays in this house. One day, my mom called me into the kitchen and I told her, hey, like, I'll be right there. And he actually whooped me with the belt because he said that I shouldn't talk to my mom like that. It was a very difficult situation to be in. I feel like people need to know what's going on, especially like your family. And if they know what's going on, then they can help you. My mom and her mom talked every morning. And when she passed, it basically took away her other half. Chris tried to make it seem like he cared. He tried to make it seem like, oh, he was just so devastated. My mother-in-law passed away, you know, but in all honesty, he really didn't care.
In our culture, and someone passed away, of course, everyone navigated to that house. And I just noticed that Chris was never there.
After my mother-in-law passed away, we got really, really close. And I just remember she called me and I remember her whispering. And I said, why are you whispering? And she said, girl, because he got them cameras in there and I don't want him to hear what I'm saying. And I was like, huh?
There were a total of 10 cameras. There were 2 in the front. Then they had one pointing towards the hallway right above the front door. He had another one in the corner of the living room so you can see the full living room and the kitchen. Like every inch of the house was covered in cameras except for our bedrooms and the bathroom.
That was just real creepy for me. You have no privacy, you know. Olivia can't have a decent conversation without, you know, him knowing about it.
He could look at the cameras anytime he wanted to. He can also talk through the cameras and we can actually talk to him back. So if while he was at work and he seen that we were in the hallway or something, he can actually talk through it. And there were also night vision. Everything was very disturbing. Because if you were living in a house, then you would know, like, this should not be happening. You're not supposed to be living in fear. One night, Chris and my mom were in the room arguing. The door was shut. And all I could hear was like, Chris, I can't breathe. Chris, I can't breathe. And I opened the door and I said, Mama, are you okay? And the door quickly slammed. And it slammed so fast that it hit my forehead. He came out and he started yelling at me. He started putting his finger right here on my forehead and like pushing me back. And I was like, you think I'm just gonna let you put your hands on my mom? And she's telling me, she's screaming out she can't breathe. Are you crazy? I said, Mom, are you really gonna let him do this to you? Why are you doing this? Why are you allowing him to do this? And she basically said, Ariel, when I feel like enough is enough, then I'm gonna leave. And I said, are you serious? You're really gonna sit up here and let him continue to do this to you? He knew it. He knew that she wouldn't leave him as long as he said the right words. I didn't want them to get married. It took everything out of me not to object during the wedding. But I seen how her face was so lit up. She had the biggest smile on her face. You should have seen her, like her heart was so, it was so happy. I didn't want to be the one to ruin that for her, because she had so many hopes, she had so many dreams to be a wife, to be a mother, to live in a stable household. I didn't want to ruin that fantasy for her.
And she came and she hugged us both and she was crying just to see us there. And she said, I'm just so happy to see y'all here because, you know, her sisters weren't there.
It was sad that my siblings weren't there. It was strictly because Chris did not want them there and they didn't feel welcome.
Chris wasn't going to accept anything that wasn't his way. If it was either his way or the highway. And if he said he didn't want someone there, then that person was not going to be there. He would get into fights at work. And his problems was he didn't know how to control his anger. He also brought recordings back to the house. The surveillance footage that he showed me showed him beating up the inmates so bad that he couldn't even move. They had to transport him to the ER with all his injuries. I couldn't look at that. It was too much for me. I've never seen that type of anger before in my whole life. He showed us so that way we can get in line also, to show like this is what he do to people that don't follow his rules. Chris was having troubles with his job. He was on suspension.
Olivia at that point had built up a clientele base where she had tons of clients utilizing her tax business. Seeing our family kind of struggle, it created an ambition within her for her to go out and want better in life.
She definitely made probably 2-3 times more than he did.
Olivia and Chris, what they did was start another business, which was a food truck business. So Olivia took the money that she earned and invested it into the food truck to get it up and going and get it running. And that way Olivia can continue to do what she was doing.
The idea, I would say, was his. But she was the one that was doing all the work. She was the one going to buy the food, prep the food, make sure the labels and stuff was correct. She made it seem like he did all the work. When in reality, the only thing he did was load the truck and cook the food. That was it. He just had her by the collar and just whatever he wanted, she was gonna go do. So graduating high school, I just knew that I was about to go to college. I was about to be free. And I just had a big sigh of relief of me finally getting away from that house. But it also scared me because I had to leave them behind. Not only my mom, but my sister. That wasn't how things were supposed to go. And yeah. On February 13th of 2019, I had a feeling that I need to talk to my mom and just let her know, like, hey, I love you. I'm gonna bring you your Valentine's Day gift up here tomorrow. After that phone call, I was a little uneasy, and that whole night I could not sleep. I just had a feeling like something was gonna happen, like something was off, but I just couldn't put my finger on it.
Beaumont 911, what is the address of your emergency?
I'm at home. My wife is shot at me. Please, her. Please, please. My wife, please!
On February 14th, I got a call from Chris around 9:12 in the morning, and he was basically saying, hey, Ariel, something happened.
Come this way.
Okay.
Please, come this way. This way, this way.
Okay.
Please. Olivia!
Okay.
Baby!
Sir. Okay. Sit back. Sit back.
What's up, Mr. Booker?
I was like, is she okay? Like, what's going on? And he was like, Ariel, it don't look good.
Yes.
What happened?
We had a disagreement. And I say, baby, if you're not working with me, you're working against me. I say, we've been doing this. My 19-year-old stepdaughter was 8. My 11-year-old was 1. I say, Olivia, if we can't get it together, we can't be together.
Okay.
We got several, and I say, I just want a divorce.
Mm-hmm.
And her reaction was, and I've been saying this for quite some time,
Mm-hmm.
and her reaction was, if you don't want me, I'm gonna kill myself.
And he said that she ran in the house and got the gun, and she put it up to her head, and she was telling him, if I can't have you, nobody can have you.
We got a loaded gun on the side of the bed. We got a loaded shotgun in the corner where the video games is.
And he said that when he was trying to get the gun, that it accidentally went off.
I said, give me the gun. She like, I don't remember which hand. I'm like, give me that gun. What is you doing? Stop trying to scare me.
Uh-huh.
I took it.
So when you grabbed it, it went off?
She yanked.
She
I
yanked.
grabbed it and she yanked back. And the gun went off.
Okay.
The gun went off.
All right.
And I did the best I could.
What's your last name?
Jones.
I got there in a matter of 15 minutes. I drove around the corner, all I seen was cops, and I seen the caution tape. The police officers, they stopped me, and I was just like, I just want to see her. I went to his mom and I asked her, like what's going on? Is she okay? Like, is she alive? And she had the same face Chris had, blank. And she said, Ariel, she's not alive. And I broke down.
I pulled up to a site that I thought I would never see, with police everywhere, with detectives everywhere, with crime scene tape everywhere. I pulled up to a nightmare.
When I got on scene, Olivia's car was in the driveway. Her keys were on the trunk of her car. Her phone was inside of her car. There was cold food product in her car, hamburger meat, things of that nature. There was a bouquet of flowers in the car that seemed to have been there for Valentine's Day. It seemed like she was in the middle of something that morning, and it got interrupted by this incident. We made our way through the house to find Olivia, and she was deceased in her bedroom. She was lying on the floor on her stomach, partially clothed. There was a great deal of blood. There was blood spatter. It wasn't until we rolled her over and saw an exit wound coming out of her left eye that we realized that the round had actually struck her in the back of the head. Something that we did notice throughout the home were cameras, surveillance cameras. So we were hopeful we would be able to get some information from those cameras. Absolutely nothing on that scene pointed to a woman that was suicidal or depressed or intending on taking her life that day.
They're waiting for the lead detectives. They're going to be the ones that actually interview you, so.
We first met with Christopher Jones at the Beaumont Police Department. He agreed to speak with us, seemed very willing to do so, wanted us to know what he said had happened. They were preparing the food truck. Sometime during that preparation, he grew upset because he felt that Olivia was not doing her share of the work, had failed him and was not keeping up where she should.
There's no reason that certain things wouldn't get done. I am very particular. If you heard that, that's true. I am very particular. You strive for the best for people. I work really hard, and I don't make excuses for myself, and I don't accept excuses for anybody else.
So because of these things, he decided he wanted to get a divorce. She stormed into the house, went straight to the bedroom, put a gun to her head.
What did you say?
Really? Are you serious? Really? This is not going to solve anything.
Okay.
You know, you do not want to do that. Put that freaking gun down before you make a mistake and hurt yourself. She was crying. She was crying.
Well, during this time, we happened to ask him about the surveillance cameras around his house. We asked if we could have permission to view those on his phone. He was very willing to allow us access to those cameras.
Say you want to access just that camera. You touch that. And that's just that camera.
Okay.
You follow what I'm saying?
So far, let's go back to devices.
Yes, sir.
And
everything is labeled.
Carport, backyard, front door, back door, laundry room, inside garage, living room, kitchen.
But the videos weren't there.
Why would there be no recordings on that?
I don't know. It should be. But like I said, the internet, you can go through days and it pretty much does, we shouldn't have bought that. You just keep, you can pick whatever day you want and it's never going to be consistent. That's why I say it was a waste of money.
There was a change in Christopher's demeanor. He wouldn't look us in the eye.
Well, I'm wanting desperately to find some video on here that corroborates what you're telling us, but almost all the videos start right after this event happened.
His immediate reaction was that the system was faulty. He told me that he had been lazy in charging the cameras.
I was scared. I was scared.
Okay. Have you been honest with me today?
Yes, ma'am. I was confused.
Look me in the eye.
I was confused about a lot of things.
Look me in the eyes. If you've been honest with me today, tell me how many videos you deleted.
It was obvious that he was being very deceptive.
If I deleted those videos, I look guilty.
Not if you say right now, or what you just say a little while ago, I freaked out, I panicked, I did some stuff I shouldn't have done. Is that one of them?
Yes.
How many did you delete?
I don't know, honestly.
Okay.
How many had he deleted? And come to find out, everything except one camera. The only video that we saw around the time of the incident was the one showing that Olivia didn't go storming through the house. She didn't go to the bedroom. None of those things. She was actually in the kitchen, washing up, cleaning up from preparing food. Christopher was in the kitchen as well. He's the one that walked toward the bedroom first. He stopped in the hallway. When Olivia walked around to go toward the bedroom, she was startled to find him there. When that video ended, it was less than 3 minutes later that Christopher was on the phone with 911 saying that his wife was shot in the head.
I'm at home, my wife is trying to leave. Please hurry, please, please. My wife, please!
I think the reason that one camera was still there is he ran out of time. When Christopher was supposed to be saving his wife's life, he was out in the front yard deleting videos. By the time that interview had ended that day, Christopher was placed under arrest for murder.
And there was several videos shown during that trial that showed him being an absolute monster to my sister. It was like a nightmare living that trial.
Then you gonna be looking stupid. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the floor, White. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the floor. Look on the that is why is that like that? You're not paying attention. What the leave? You wasn't worried about the son of a bitch a minute ago. That's your mother. Don't look at me like that, bitch. I'm not playing with you, lazy. You want to do something now that I'm give it here. You got all the goddamn answers. You don't do a goddamn thing around this right. This your ass, bitch. That clean dish, that's clean.
I didn't want to, they fell on the floor, so I didn't want to reuse them.
You look at this. You don't pay attention to what the you doing. You all over the place, Olivia. You ain't got the chance to clean no home. Food on the wall. Who you bringing now?
Me.
Harriet don't live here. It's you. It always been you.
Once I seen the video footage, I was just filled with sadness, so much sadness. I felt guilt as to why didn't I see that? Why didn't I know that she was dealing with it was just this bad? You know, why didn't I say something when I could have?
Typically, the victim will make excuses for the violent person. The victim will think that they can fix the violent person. And either way, they think that they're in love with the violent person. Once violence begins, it doesn't just stop.
Act like you ain't got no patience. You want to have a kid? I'll about my kid.
And I'm going to get emotional. It breaks your heart that she went through what she went through. It hurts to know that she, for whatever reason, could not remove herself from that relationship. And but for that, she would still be here today.
I can honestly say he took a piece of everyone's heart, everyone's soul. He crushed it.
Every day I put on this ribbon, this purple ribbon. I put that ribbon on every day in remembrance of her. And it signifies domestic violence. So I wear it every single day. I love her and I miss her dearly. It's a nightmare. Think about it all the time.
The call came in just after sunrise, the kind of call dispatchers remember long after their shift ends. A quiet neighborhood in Northern California. A door left slightly open. A car still parked in the driveway. And inside the house, a silence that didn't feel normal. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses against the walls. When officers arrived, the street looked ordinary. Lawns trimmed. Mailboxes standing straight. A dog barking somewhere in the distance. Nothing about the small beige house on Redwood Lane suggested it would become the center of one of the most unsettling cold cases California would carry for decades. But the moment the officers stepped inside, something was wrong. The living room looked untouched. The television remote sat neatly on the coffee table. A half-empty glass of water rested beside it, condensation still faintly visible. A newspaper from the previous morning lay folded on the couch. And yet the house felt abandoned. No signs of struggle. No broken furniture. No shattered glass. Just a strange stillness. Upstairs, the bedroom door was open. The bed had been slept in. Sheets wrinkled. A pillow slightly dented. On the nightstand sat a small alarm clock frozen at 2:17 a.m., its red digital numbers blinking faintly. But the woman who lived there was gone. Her name was Melissa Carter. 32 years old. A local elementary school teacher. Known in the neighborhood as the woman who jogged every morning before work, rain or shine. Reliable. Predictable. The kind of person who never simply vanished. When detectives began asking questions, the timeline became even stranger. Melissa had been seen the night before around 9:30 p.m. at a nearby grocery store. Security cameras showed her walking through the aisles, buying milk, bread, and a frozen dinner. Nothing unusual. She smiled at the cashier. Paid in cash. Walked out carrying a single plastic bag. That was the last confirmed sighting. Her car returned home shortly after 10. Neighbors later said they remembered seeing the porch light come on. One neighbor thought he heard the front door close. After that, nothing. No phone calls. No emails. No bank activity. By the next morning, when Melissa failed to show up at school, the front office assumed she was sick. Teachers get sick. It happens. But by noon, concern began to grow. Melissa had never missed work without calling. Not once in 7 years. At 3:14 p.m., the school principal dialed her number. No answer. At 5:02 p.m., Melissa's younger sister tried calling too. Straight to voicemail. By the next morning, the sister drove to the house on Redwood Lane. And that's when she noticed the front door slightly open. Police quickly treated the scene as suspicious. But suspicious didn't mean violent. Not yet. Inside, investigators searched every corner. Melissa's purse was still hanging near the door. Her wallet inside. Driver's license. Credit cards. $36 in cash. Her phone sat charging on the kitchen counter. Her keys were placed neatly in a ceramic bowl. People who plan to disappear do not leave everything behind. Detectives widened the search. Neighbors were interviewed. Co-workers questioned. Friends contacted. Everyone told the same story. Melissa Carter had no enemies. No recent arguments. No dramatic breakup. No financial trouble. No reason to vanish. But investigators noticed something else. The back door. Unlike the front, it had been carefully closed. Locked from the inside. That detail unsettled detectives almost immediately. If someone entered through the back, they would have had to leave through the front. And that front door had been left slightly open. As if someone had walked out quickly. Or quietly. Or both. For the next 48 hours, the quiet neighborhood turned into a swarm of activity. Police tape stretched across the lawn. Patrol cars lined the street. Reporters began arriving with cameras. Search teams combed nearby wooded areas. Helicopters circled overhead. Volunteers distributed flyers with Melissa's photograph. A smiling face. Brown hair. Bright eyes. Underneath it, the words "Missing, please help." But the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the case became. Melissa's computer showed nothing unusual. No threatening emails. No secret correspondence. Her phone records were clean. Her bank account untouched. Yet one small detail inside the house caught a detective's attention. In the kitchen sink sat a single plate. On the plate were the remains of a frozen dinner. Half eaten. The fork still resting beside it. The microwave clock read 10:46 p.m. Which meant Melissa had come home. She had heated food. She had started eating. Then something happened. Something that interrupted her meal so suddenly she never returned to finish it. That realization changed everything. Because it meant Melissa had not left willingly. Something, or someone, had entered that house late that night. And taken her. But there was still a problem. No fingerprints. No forced entry. No sign of violence. Even the carpet looked undisturbed. It was as if Melissa Carter had simply dissolved into thin air. Within a week, the story exploded across local news stations. Teacher missing in quiet California town. Mystery deepens on Redwood Lane. Cold case in the making. The words felt dramatic at first. But investigators already sensed the truth creeping in. Without a body. Without a suspect. Without evidence. Cases like this had a way of freezing in time. And that's exactly what began to happen. Weeks turned into months. The search teams slowly disappeared. The news vans stopped coming. Flyers faded in the sun. The house on Redwood Lane stayed empty. But inside police headquarters, Melissa Carter's file kept growing thicker. Every tip was logged. Every rumor checked. One caller claimed they saw a van near the house that night. Another reported hearing a loud sound around 2 a.m. But none of it led anywhere. Then came the first real lead. 3 months after Melissa vanished, detectives discovered something chilling buried deep in her call records. A number that appeared 3 times the night she disappeared. A number that didn't belong to any friend, co-worker, or family member. The calls were short. Less than 30 seconds each. The final call occurred at 2:11 a.m. Just 6 minutes before the alarm clock upstairs stopped blinking at 2:17. When investigators tried calling the number back, it had been disconnected. Registered to a prepaid phone. No name. No address. Just another dead end. And slowly, the case began drifting toward that terrible category every detective fears. A cold case. But what nobody realized then was that the truth had already passed quietly through that neighborhood once before. Unnoticed. Unquestioned. Hidden behind an ordinary face that nobody suspected. And somewhere in the darkness of that California night, in 2003, someone walked out of Melissa Carter's house knowing exactly what had happened inside. knowing where she had gone. Knowing a secret that would haunt the town for years. A secret that, for a very long time, would stay buried. The first winter after Melissa Carter vanished settled over Redwood Lane like a quiet weight. The police tape eventually came down. The search teams packed their equipment. The news vans stopped parking along the sidewalks. But inside the Carter case file, the pages kept multiplying. Detectives knew something important had happened between 10:46 p.m., when Melissa's microwave stopped, and 2:17 a.m., when the alarm clock upstairs blinked in the dark. Those 3 hours were a black hole. And somewhere inside them Melissa Carter disappeared. Investigators began reconstructing every minute of her final evening. Surveillance cameras from nearby streets were collected. Store receipts analyzed. Phone towers mapped. Melissa had driven home alone. That much was clear. Her sedan appeared on a traffic camera 2 blocks from her house at 9:58 p.m. She turned onto Redwood Lane at 10:02 p.m. The porch light came on minutes later. Then the house went quiet. But something still bothered Detective Aaron Mills, the lead investigator assigned to the case. Mills had spent 15 years chasing disappearances, and he knew patterns. People rarely vanished without leaving some kind of ripple. Yet Melissa's life looked perfectly stable. Her job evaluations were excellent. Her finances steady. Her social life normal. Friends described her as cautious, organized, routine-driven. Routine-driven people do not open their doors to strangers at 2 in the morning. Unless they recognize the person standing there. That theory began pushing investigators toward a difficult conclusion. Whoever entered Melissa's house that night, she probably knew them. The next step was obvious. Re-examine everyone in her circle. Family first. Melissa's parents lived in Oregon and had not visited in months. Her younger sister had an alibi confirmed by co-workers at a late-night restaurant shift. Then came friends and colleagues. Dozens of interviews. Teachers. Neighbors. Parents of her students. Every conversation felt the same, disbelief mixed with fear. Because the more people detectives questioned, the clearer one unsettling fact became. Melissa Carter was the kind of person who trusted people. She helped neighbors carry groceries. She stayed late tutoring struggling students. She once organized a fundraiser for a student whose father had cancer. She was the last person anyone imagined at the center of a crime story. Which made the silence around her disappearance feel even heavier. Weeks turned into months. Then investigators uncovered something strange inside her phone records. Not the unknown prepaid number. Something else. In the weeks before Melissa vanished, she had received several late-night calls from a number belonging to a man named David Larkin. The name didn't immediately trigger alarms. David Larkin lived only 4 streets away. 37 years old. Worked as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. More importantly, he had once fixed Melissa's car. That was how they had met. Detectives brought him in for questioning. At first glance, Larkin appeared calm. Cooperative. Even sympathetic. He remembered Melissa. Said she seemed nice. He admitted they had spoken on the phone a few times about her car making a strange noise weeks earlier. But he insisted the calls were strictly about repairs. When asked why the conversations happened late at night, Larkin shrugged. Shop hours were busy, he said. Sometimes customers call after work. Detectives pressed harder. Had he visited her house? No. Had she visited his shop again recently? No. Had he seen her the night she disappeared? Larkin shook his head. I heard about it on the news like everyone else. His story sounded reasonable. But something still bothered Detective Mills. Phone logs showed the calls between Melissa and Larkin had grown longer as the weeks passed. What began as 2-minute conversations had stretched into 15 minutes. Then 20. The last call between them occurred 2 days before Melissa vanished. It lasted 28 minutes. When detectives asked Larkin what they talked about for nearly half an hour, his answer came quickly. Probably about the car. The explanation didn't quite fit. 28 minutes about a noise in an engine. Still, suspicion alone wasn't evidence. Without proof, Larkin walked out of the station that afternoon. Another loose thread. Another unanswered question. Meanwhile, the Carter case began slipping into that dangerous territory where time erodes everything. Witness memories faded. Tips slowed down. Even the flyers around town began peeling off telephone poles. But inside Melissa's empty house, investigators made one final discovery before the property was eventually returned to the family. It happened during a second forensic sweep months after the disappearance. A technician examining the hallway floor noticed something unusual beneath the carpet fibers. A faint discoloration. Barely visible. The spot was small, about the size of a coin. Tests confirmed it. Human blood. DNA analysis revealed the blood belonged to Melissa Carter. The discovery instantly changed the tone of the investigation. Until that moment, police had technically classified the case as a missing person. Now it looked like something darker. Something violent. But the blood stain raised more questions than it answered. There was so little of it. No large pools. No signs of struggle. Just a single drop embedded in the carpet. As if someone had been injured briefly. Then removed from the scene. The hallway where the stain was found led directly to the front door. Which meant one thing was becoming painfully clear. Melissa Carter had likely left the house that night. But not under her own power. Detectives began theorizing. Perhaps she opened the door for someone she recognized. Perhaps an argument started. Perhaps she was struck. But why was there so little blood? And why had neighbors heard nothing? No screams. No crash. No car speeding away. Just silence. Then another strange clue surfaced. A neighbor across the street contacted police months after the investigation had already cooled. At first she assumed the detail wasn't important. But the longer Melissa remained missing, the more the memory bothered her. The neighbor reported that sometime around 2:30 a.m. the night Melissa vanished, she had briefly woken up. Through her bedroom window she saw headlights on Redwood Lane. A vehicle parked in front of Melissa's house. But not Melissa's car. This vehicle was larger. Possibly a truck. The engine was running. And she remembered something else. A person standing near the passenger side door. Tall. Male. But the streetlight glare made the face impossible to see. The vehicle remained there for only a few minutes. Then it drove away slowly. At the time, the neighbor assumed it was someone visiting late. She rolled over and went back to sleep. That memory suddenly became one of the most important clues in the case. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood again, searching for any resident who owned a truck matching the description. Several possibilities surfaced. But none could be definitively placed near Melissa's house that night. Including David Larkin. Still, Detective Mills couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was hiding somewhere inside those early morning hours. between 2:11 a.m., when the final mystery phone call occurred, and 2:30 a.m., when the truck was seen leaving the street. 19 minutes. That narrow slice of time might hold the entire answer. But time was already beginning to work against them. Evidence fades. Witnesses forget. And suspects learn to stay quiet. As the months turned into a year, Melissa Carter's case officially received the label investigators dread the most. Unsolved. A cold case. But cold cases have a strange way of lingering. Because somewhere, someone always carries the truth. Someone who remembers exactly what happened in that quiet California house in 2003. Someone who knows why Melissa Carter never finished her dinner. Someone who knows what happened during those 19 missing minutes. And most terrifying of all, someone who walked away from Redwood Lane that night believing the secret would never surface again. By the summer of 2004, Melissa Carter's name had begun to fade from headlines, but inside the small police department that first answered the call on Redwood Lane, the case still lingered like unfinished business. The evidence room held only a few boxes labeled with her name, photographs of the house, forensic reports, interview transcripts, and a thin plastic bag containing a section of carpet cut from the hallway floor where the single drop of blood had been discovered. It wasn't much. For a disappearance that shook an entire community, the physical evidence felt almost insultingly small. Detective Aaron Mills refused to let it sit quietly. He had worked cases before that dissolved into the cold case archives, but something about Melissa's disappearance gnawed at him. It wasn't just the lack of answers. It was the strange calmness of the crime scene. Most violent abductions leave chaos behind, broken furniture, overturned lamps, signs of panic. But Melissa's home had looked like someone paused life mid-sentence and then erased the person who lived there. Mills began reviewing every interview again, line by line. The neighbors. The co-workers. The mechanic. David Larkin's name appeared repeatedly in the margins of his notes. At first, Larkin had seemed like just another peripheral acquaintance. But the more Mills revisited the transcripts, the more certain details began to stand out. Larkin had been calm during questioning. Too calm. He never asked what investigators believed had happened. He never seemed surprised by the timeline detectives presented. And when they mentioned the strange late-night calls between him and Melissa, he brushed them aside almost casually. But there was another detail. Something small. During the original interview, Larkin mentioned he had been home the night Melissa disappeared. Alone. Watching television. He even remembered the show, a late-night rerun of a crime drama. But when detectives later checked the program schedule for that evening, the show he named had aired 2 nights earlier. It might have been a simple mistake. Or it might have been something else. Detective Mills decided to dig deeper into Larkin's background. What he found was not dramatic at first. No violent criminal record. No arrests for assault. Just a handful of minor infractions, traffic tickets, a citation for disorderly conduct years earlier. But then another detail surfaced. 2 years before Melissa disappeared, a woman had filed a complaint against Larkin. The report described an uncomfortable encounter at his auto shop. The woman claimed Larkin had been overly friendly, asking personal questions, lingering too long during the repair process. When she declined an invitation to dinner, he allegedly called her repeatedly for several days. Eventually the calls stopped. The woman never pressed charges. But the complaint sat quietly in the police database. Mills read the report twice. It didn't prove anything. But it suggested a pattern. Larkin had a habit of crossing personal boundaries with female customers. Melissa Carter had been one of those customers. Another interview with Larkin seemed inevitable. But before detectives could arrange it, the case took another unexpected turn. In early August 2004, nearly a year after Melissa vanished, a hiker discovered something deep inside a wooded area 20 miles outside town. The area was rugged terrain, dry brush, scattered oak trees, and winding dirt trails rarely visited except by hikers and hunters. At first, the hiker thought it was trash. A torn piece of fabric partially buried beneath leaves. But when he looked closer, he noticed the pattern. Blue cotton. With small white flowers. The discovery was reported to authorities within hours. When detectives arrived, they carefully uncovered the item. It was part of a blouse. A woman's blouse. Forensic teams examined the fabric under powerful lights. Dirt clung to the threads, but the pattern looked familiar to investigators, who had studied Melissa Carter's wardrobe photographs dozens of times. They rushed back to the evidence room. Inside Melissa's missing person file was a photograph taken from her closet the week she vanished. Detectives had documented everything she owned, hoping to determine what she might have been wearing the night she disappeared. One blouse in the photo looked almost identical. Blue. White flowers. Same pattern. The possibility sent a chill through the investigation. If the blouse belonged to Melissa, it meant her disappearance had not been random. Someone had taken her far away from Redwood Lane. Search teams flooded the wooded area for days. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder across the hills. Dogs sniffed the ground. Helicopters hovered overhead. But the forest revealed nothing else. No body. No additional clothing. Just the torn piece of fabric. Still, the discovery forced detectives to confront a darker theory: Melissa Carter might not be missing. She might be dead. Forensic analysis took weeks. Then the lab results arrived. The fabric did belong to Melissa Carter. Microscopic fibers matched samples taken from clothing in her closet. The case officially shifted from missing person to suspected homicide. The announcement shocked the town all over again. For nearly a year, many residents had clung to hope that Melissa might still be alive somewhere. Now that hope collapsed. The reality was harder to face. Someone had taken her life and managed to leave almost nothing behind. Detective Mills immediately reopened the list of potential suspects. And once again, David Larkin's name moved closer to the top. Not because of direct evidence. Because of proximity. Because of the phone calls. Because of the uneasy feeling Mills couldn't shake. Detectives returned to Larkin's auto shop on a hot August afternoon. The smell of motor oil hung thick in the air as mechanics worked beneath lifted vehicles. Larkin looked surprised to see them again. But only for a moment. Then the same calm expression returned. They told him about the fabric found in the woods. They told him the case was now being treated as a homicide investigation. Larkin listened quietly. When they asked where he had been the night Melissa disappeared, his answer did not change. At home. Alone. Watching television. They asked if he had ever been to the wooded area where the blouse was found. He shrugged. Maybe once or twice years ago. People hike there. His tone never shifted. No anger. No fear. Just mild cooperation. And again, without solid evidence, detectives had no choice but to let him go. But as Mills watched Larkin walk back into the garage, something about the man's posture struck him. Confidence. The kind of confidence people carry when they believe they cannot be touched. Meanwhile, the Carter case continued drifting through the slow machinery of time. 2 years passed. Then 3. The wooded hills where the fabric was discovered returned to silence. Melissa's house on Redwood Lane was eventually sold to a new family, who tried to ignore the whispers surrounding the property. Children played in the yard again. Lights glowed through the windows at night. Life moved forward. But for Melissa's family, time never truly advanced. Her sister kept a photograph of them together on her kitchen table. Two young women smiling at the camera. A moment frozen long before that strange night in 2003. Before the unanswered phone calls. Before the silent house. Before the 19 missing minutes. And somewhere out there, the person responsible continued living an ordinary life. Working. Sleeping. Talking with neighbors. All while carrying the memory of what really happened after Melissa Carter opened her front door. A memory hidden so carefully that even years later, investigators still stood at the edge of the same question. Who was the man in the truck on Redwood Lane at 2:30 in the morning? And what happened inside Melissa Carter's house during those final minutes before she vanished forever? By 2006, the Carter case had grown quiet enough that younger officers in the department only knew it by reputation. A few had joined the force after Melissa Carter disappeared, hearing fragments of the story during late-night shifts. Something about a teacher who vanished from her own home, a drop of blood in the hallway, the torn blouse found miles away in the hills. To them, it sounded like the kind of case detectives talk about when they want to warn rookies. Some mysteries refuse to give up their answers. But for Detective Aaron Mills, the file never truly left his desk. Every few months he opened the thick folder again, rereading witness statements that he nearly knew by heart. The neighbor who saw the truck. The grocery store cashier who remembered Melissa smiling politely. The mechanic who insisted the late-night calls were only about a car repair. David Larkin. The name still circled in red pen across multiple pages. Yet despite the suspicion, the case against him remained frustratingly thin. No witnesses placed him near Melissa's house that night. No forensic evidence connected him to the scene. His phone records showed nothing unusual after the final conversation 2 days before Melissa vanished. It was as if every thread investigators pulled simply snapped in their hands. Then something unexpected happened. A new detective joined the department's investigative unit, Detective Laura Chen. She had transferred from a larger city department, where she had worked several long-term missing person cases. Chen was methodical, quiet, and known for approaching old files with fresh eyes. Within her first month, she asked about the Carter case. Mills handed her the file. He expected her to skim it once and move on. Instead, Chen spent 3 days reading every page. When she finally closed the folder, she asked a simple question. Why did the alarm clock stop at 2:17? The detail had bothered Mills since the beginning. But there had never been an explanation. The digital clock upstairs had been unplugged. The cord hung loosely beside the nightstand when officers first entered the bedroom. Investigators assumed Melissa unplugged it earlier in the evening while cleaning or rearranging the room. But Chen saw it differently. If she unplugged it earlier, Chen said quietly, the time wouldn't stop at 2:17. It would stop earlier in the night. Mills stared at her for a moment. Chen continued. The clock stopped because someone unplugged it at 2:17 a.m. The realization spread slowly through the room. If Chen was right, it meant something very specific. Someone had been in Melissa's bedroom at 2:17 a.m. But Melissa's dinner had been half eaten downstairs. Which meant she likely hadn't gone upstairs voluntarily. Chen flipped open the file again. Look at the hallway blood drop, she said. The tiny stain detectives discovered months later. Melissa's blood. located halfway between the kitchen and the front door. Chen traced the house layout with her finger. If she was injured in the hallway, why would someone go upstairs afterward? Mills didn't answer, because the question carried an unsettling implication. Someone might have searched the house, looking for something, or making sure something wasn't left behind. That theory pushed investigators toward a new possibility they hadn't fully explored. What if the crime wasn't purely impulsive? What if the person inside the house had a reason to move through the rooms? Chen suggested reopening the property records. Specifically, she wanted to know everything about Melissa's house before she bought it. The request seemed strange at first, but as investigators dug through county documents, they uncovered something interesting. Melissa had purchased the house only 8 months before she disappeared. The previous owner was an elderly man named Robert Hale, who had passed away shortly before the sale. The house had been vacant for several months during probate. During that time, the property was occasionally accessed by maintenance workers and contractors preparing it for sale. One of those contractors had repaired the garage door. His name appeared in the property records. David Larkin. The same mechanic detectives had already questioned. The discovery shifted the timeline of their connection. Melissa didn't meet Larkin through a random car repair. They might have first crossed paths during the house renovation months earlier. Which meant Larkin knew the layout of the house. He knew the neighborhood. He knew where Melissa lived before she even moved in. Chen leaned back in her chair. Maybe the car repair was just an excuse, she said. The possibility hung heavily in the air. If Larkin had known Melissa's home beforehand, his presence in her life might not have been coincidence. But suspicion still wasn't proof. Detectives needed something concrete. So they returned to an overlooked piece of evidence, the mysterious prepaid phone number that called Melissa 3 times the night she disappeared. 4 years the number had gone nowhere. The phone had been discarded. The registration false. But technology had advanced since 2003. Cell tower data, once too vague to help, could now be analyzed more precisely. Chen requested a new review. Weeks later, analysts produced a detailed map of the signal. The prepaid phone connected briefly to 3 towers during those calls. The triangulated area narrowed the location significantly. The calls were made within half a mile of Melissa's house. In the early hours of the morning. Right before she vanished. Detectives pulled Larkin's phone records again for comparison. His personal phone had been inactive during that same time window. Turned off. Or powered down. Chen stared at the overlapping timelines. The prepaid phone calls. The truck sighting at 2:30 a.m. The unplugged clock at 2:17. The hallway blood drop. Each piece alone meant little. But together they formed a shadowy outline. Someone contacted Melissa in the middle of the night. Someone she trusted enough to open the door for. Someone who knew the house well enough to move through it without leaving obvious signs. Someone who might have used a second phone to avoid detection. And someone who lived only minutes away. But the years had already complicated everything. By the time detectives reopened these angles, David Larkin had moved. His auto shop closed 2 years earlier. Neighbors reported he relocated to another part of California for work. Tracking him down took weeks. When they finally located his new address and requested another interview, investigators hoped time might have loosened something. Sometimes people make mistakes after years pass. Sometimes their stories shift. But when Larkin sat across the table again, He looked almost exactly the same. Older, perhaps. But still calm. Still cooperative. Still certain. Detectives told him the investigation had been reopened. They told him about the prepaid phone analysis. They asked again about the night Melissa Carter disappeared. Larkin listened quietly. Then he leaned back and gave the same answer he had given 3 years earlier. I was home. Alone. Watching television. The words sounded almost rehearsed now. When they asked about repairing the garage door at Melissa's house months before she moved in, he nodded. Yeah. I did a lot of those jobs. When they asked if he ever visited her house after that, his answer didn't change. No. And when detectives asked if he owned a truck in 2003, Larkin smiled faintly. Half the town owns trucks. Without evidence, the interview ended exactly the way the first one had. With Larkin walking out. Free. And as the door closed behind him, Detective Mills felt the same cold frustration that had haunted the case since the beginning. Because the truth felt close. So close it almost had a shape. Yet somehow it still remained just out of reach. And somewhere in the quiet memories of that night in 2003, the secret of what happened to Melissa Carter was still waiting. Buried inside 19 minutes that nobody had ever truly seen. The Carter case returned to silence again after the second interview with David Larkin. Not because detectives had lost interest, but because they had run headfirst into the same wall that had blocked them from the beginning. Suspicion without proof. Investigators could feel the outline of something dark moving beneath the surface of the evidence, but every time they tried to grab hold of it, their hands closed on nothing. Still, the new analysis had changed the way the department viewed the timeline. For years, detectives imagined Melissa Carter's disappearance as a sudden act, a knock on the door, an argument, a moment of violence that ended with her being forced into a waiting vehicle. But Detective Laura Chen's observations suggested something more deliberate. Someone called her 3 times in the middle of the night. Someone unplugged the clock upstairs at exactly 2:17 a.m. Someone walked through the house after the moment of violence. That wasn't chaos. That was control. Chen returned to the house on Redwood Lane one quiet afternoon, nearly 3 years after Melissa vanished. The new owners had long since settled in. Children's bicycles leaned against the garage. A wind chime clinked softly near the porch. The family living there knew the history of the property, but they tried not to dwell on it. Chen asked permission to walk through the house. Inside, the layout felt smaller than the photographs in the case file suggested. The kitchen sat only a few steps from the hallway where Melissa's blood had been found. The staircase leading to the bedroom was narrow, the wooden steps creaking slightly underfoot. Chen moved slowly, imagining the sequence investigators had discussed countless times. Melissa eating dinner. A phone call. Another call. Then another. Perhaps the caller asking her to open the door. Perhaps promising something simple, a quick conversation, a small favor. At 2:11 a.m., the final call connected. 6 minutes later, the bedroom clock lost power. Chen stood in the upstairs room and studied the nightstand where the alarm clock had once Saturday. The window faced the street. From here, someone could see the entire front yard. The driveway. Even the road where the mysterious truck had been spotted. If someone stood here at 2:17 a.m., they could have been watching for something. Or someone. The thought tightened Chen's chest. She walked back downstairs, stopping in the hallway where the tiny blood stain had been discovered years earlier. The carpet had long been replaced, but Chen knew exactly where the spot had been. halfway between the kitchen and the front door. A place where someone might have tried to leave. Or been stopped. The house offered no answers. Only echoes. But sometimes the truth hides outside the crime scene rather than inside it. Chen began looking deeper into David Larkin's life during the months before Melissa disappeared. Employment records. Financial statements. Vehicle registrations. One discovery caught her attention almost immediately. In early 2003, just months before Melissa bought the house, Larkin had purchased a used pickup truck from a private seller. Dark green. Full-sized. Exactly the kind of vehicle a sleepy neighbor might glimpse under a streetlight at 2:30 in the morning. The truck had been sold again in 2004. Not long after Melissa vanished. Investigators tracked down the second owner. The man lived 2 counties away and barely remembered the purchase. He had bought the truck cheaply from Larkin's shop. But he did recall something odd. The truck's interior had been thoroughly cleaned. Almost excessively. The seats had been shampooed. The floor mats replaced. At the time, the buyer assumed the mechanic simply wanted the vehicle to look presentable before selling it. But hearing the question now, years later, made the memory feel different. Uncomfortable. Detectives asked if the truck still existed. The man shook his head. It had been totaled in a highway accident 3 years earlier. Scrapped. Gone. Another possible piece of evidence lost forever. Still, the timeline was beginning to form a clearer silhouette. Larkin owned a truck matching the neighbor's description. He had previous contact with Melissa. He lived close enough to reach her house in minutes. And his phone activity conveniently vanished during the crucial window of time. But one question still remained painfully unanswered. Why? What reason would Larkin have to target Melissa Carter? The answer began surfacing in the quietest way possible. Through an old notebook discovered inside Melissa's storage boxes. The notebook had been collected during the original investigation, but never examined closely, because it appeared to contain nothing more than ordinary reminders, shopping lists, lesson plans, and scattered personal notes. But Detective Chen noticed something unusual. Several pages near the back had been torn out. Not ripped violently. Removed carefully. As if someone didn't want those pages to exist anymore. The torn edges were clean. The missing pages likely removed before the notebook was taken into evidence. But there was something else. On the page just before the missing section, Melissa had written a single name. David. Beneath it were a few short sentences. Partially scribbled. The ink slightly smudged. The words were faint, but still readable. He keeps calling. Says he wants to talk. I told him no. Chen felt the air in the evidence room shift as she read the lines again. Melissa had been documenting something. Not just a car repair. Something persistent. Something that made her uncomfortable. And then those pages disappeared. Detectives re-examined the timeline of phone calls between Melissa and Larkin. At first the conversations had been brief. Then they grew longer. But the final week before Melissa disappeared looked different. Melissa had stopped answering. The outgoing calls vanished. Only incoming calls remained. 5 of them. All from Larkin. The last one placed 2 days before she vanished. 28 minutes long. What happened during that conversation? Did Melissa finally confront him? Did she ask him to stop contacting her? Or did something else happen that escalated the situation? No recording existed. Only the silent data of a phone log. But now the notebook entry suggested something investigators had never confirmed before. Melissa Carter might have been afraid. Not terrified. Not enough to call the police. But uneasy enough to write his name down. To document the unwanted attention. And if Larkin sensed she was pulling away. That realization opened a darker possibility. Some crimes are carefully planned. Others erupt suddenly when control slips away. When rejection collides with obsession. The Carter case might have begun as something ordinary, a mechanic noticing a friendly customer. But over time, that interest might have twisted into something else. Something quiet. Something persistent. Something that eventually arrived at Melissa's front door in the middle of the night. Detectives couldn't prove it yet. But for the first time since 2003, the investigation felt like it was moving closer to the truth rather than drifting further away. Because the story emerging from the evidence no longer looked like a random disappearance. It looked like a pattern. Phone calls. Unwanted attention. A man who knew the house. A truck seen leaving the street. A clock unplugged at 2:17 a.m. And somewhere inside those 19 missing minutes, something happened that changed everything. Something violent enough to leave a drop of blood on the hallway floor. And quiet enough that the entire neighborhood slept through it. But even now, years later, the biggest question still lingered in the shadows of the investigation. If David Larkin had something to do with Melissa Carter's disappearance. Where was she? Because finding the truth meant finding what had been hidden all along. And somewhere beyond Redwood Lane, beyond the quiet hills where the torn blouse had been discovered, Melissa Carter was still out there. Waiting to be found. Or waiting for someone to finally reveal what happened after she opened the door that night. By the time the Carter investigation entered its fourth year, the town had learned to live with the absence. The yellow missing person posters had long since faded from storefront windows. New families had moved into the neighborhood. The children who once rode bicycles past Melissa's house were older now, some of them already driving their own cars down Redwood Lane at night without thinking about the woman who had disappeared behind that quiet front door. But inside the police department, the file was no longer gathering dust. Detective Laura Chen's discovery in Melissa's notebook had shifted the tone of the investigation in a subtle but powerful way. It was no longer just a suspicion that David Larkin had been bothering her. Now there was proof that Melissa herself had written about the calls, about the persistence, about the discomfort. He keeps calling. Says he wants to talk. I told him no. 3 short sentences. But those words turned a vague connection into something much sharper. Now the investigation wasn't only about a mechanic who happened to know the victim. It was about a man who might have refused to accept rejection. Detectives began reconstructing the last week of Melissa's life in even greater detail. They interviewed co-workers again. Parents of students. Friends she occasionally met for coffee after school. Most conversations produced nothing new. But one interview finally cracked open a detail that had been sitting quietly in the background for years. The interview took place with a teacher named Angela Morris, one of Melissa's closest colleagues at the elementary school. During the original investigation, Morris had told police that Melissa seemed a little stressed during the final weeks before she disappeared, but nothing specific had come up during their conversations. This time, Detective Chen asked more direct questions. Did Melissa ever mention someone bothering her? Angela hesitated. At first, she said no. Then she frowned slightly, as if reaching into a memory that had grown hazy with time. There was something, she said slowly. A few days before Melissa vanished, the two women had stayed late after school preparing lesson plans. While packing her bag, Melissa had mentioned receiving repeated phone calls from someone she barely knew. Angela remembered asking who it was. Melissa had laughed it off at the time. "Just a guy who fixed my car," she said. Angela had asked if he was flirting. Melissa rolled her eyes. More like refusing to take a hint. The conversation lasted less than a minute before they both moved on to other topics. At the time, it felt harmless. Now it sounded very different. Detectives asked Angela if Melissa ever mentioned the man's name. Angela thought for a moment. Then nodded. David. That confirmation tightened the focus of the investigation even further. The pattern was growing clearer. Phone calls. Unwanted attention. Persistence that Melissa had begun documenting privately. But there was still no direct evidence linking Larkin to the night she vanished. Until another small detail surfaced. While reviewing phone records again, analysts noticed something investigators had previously overlooked. On the evening before Melissa disappeared, her cell phone had connected to a tower located near a grocery store several miles from her house. That wasn't unusual, Melissa often stopped there after work. But on that particular evening, another phone had connected to the same tower at nearly the exact same time. David Larkin's phone. The data didn't prove they met in person. But it suggested they had been in the same area at the same time. Investigators considered the possibility that Larkin might have followed her. Maybe by coincidence. Maybe not. They pulled surveillance footage from the grocery store archives, though the chances of finding usable video years later were slim. Most of the tapes had already been overwritten. But one exterior camera still had partial recordings preserved by the company's security system. The footage was grainy. Black and white. But detectives could clearly see Melissa's sedan pulling into the parking lot around 6:12 p.m. She walked into the store carrying a reusable shopping bag. 5 minutes later, another vehicle entered the lot. A pickup truck. Dark-colored. The camera resolution was too poor to read the license plate. But the truck parked 2 rows behind Melissa's car. The driver remained inside the vehicle. Watching. The footage lasted only a few minutes before the camera angle shifted. But when Melissa returned to her car at 6:29 p.m., the truck was still there. The driver's face was impossible to see clearly. But the silhouette suggested a man sitting behind the wheel. And when Melissa drove away, the truck followed. The discovery electrified the investigation. For the first time, there was visual evidence suggesting Melissa had been followed. The timing aligned perfectly with the pattern of calls that escalated during the final days before she vanished. Detectives compared the truck's shape to the model Larkin owned in 2003. The body style looked nearly identical. Still, without a visible license plate or clear driver identification, the footage remained circumstantial. But it added pressure. And pressure sometimes forces people to make mistakes. Investigators requested a third interview with David Larkin. This time, the tone was different from the previous conversations. They showed him the footage. They told him about Melissa's notebook entry. They explained that co-workers confirmed she had been uncomfortable with his repeated calls. For the first time since the investigation began, Larkin's calm expression flickered. Just slightly. But enough for Detective Mills to notice. When asked if he had been at the grocery store the night before Melissa disappeared, Larkin hesitated. Then shrugged. Maybe. People shop there. When asked if he had followed her car, he shook his head immediately. No. The denial came quickly. But the hesitation before answering lingered in the room. Detectives leaned forward. David, Mills said quietly, Melissa wrote that you wouldn't stop calling her. Larkin's jaw tightened. I was fixing her car. You called her 5 times in 1 week. She asked me to. But then she stopped answering. Silence stretched across the table. Larkin stared at the floor for a moment before looking back up. I didn't hurt her. The words hung in the air. No one had accused him of hurting her yet. Still, he said it. A small slip. Maybe unconscious. Maybe revealing. But still not enough. Without a body. Without physical evidence. Without a witness. The investigation remained trapped in the same frustrating position. And once again, David Larkin walked out of the station a free man. But something had changed. For years, the Carter case had been a quiet mystery. Now it felt closer to confrontation. Because the picture investigators were building no longer looked like coincidence. It looked like escalation. A man watching from a truck in a grocery store parking lot. A series of unwanted phone calls. A woman beginning to document the behavior in her notebook. Then, 2 days later, 3 mysterious calls in the middle of the night. A knock at the door. A drop of blood in the hallway. And a truck leaving Redwood Lane at 2:30 a.m., while the entire neighborhood slept. Somewhere inside that sequence of events, Melissa Carter's life ended. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets of that California town, the truth still waited. Hidden in the silence of one man, who insisted on repeating the same words every time detectives asked him what happened that night. I was home. Alone. Watching television. But the deeper investigators dug into the story, the more fragile that alibi began to sound. Because secrets buried for years have a strange way of shifting. And sooner or later, something always moves beneath the surface. The pressure building around David Larkin did not explode overnight. It moved slowly, almost invisibly, like a crack spreading through glass. From the outside, nothing seemed to change. The town still woke up to the same quiet mornings. The school where Melissa Carter once taught still rang with the voices of children every weekday at 8 o'clock. Redwood Lane still looked like the kind of street where nothing violent could ever happen. But inside the investigation, something had shifted. For the first time since 2003, detectives believed they were no longer chasing a ghost. They were circling a man. David Larkin. Yet the deeper they looked into his life, the stranger the edges of the story became. Detective Laura Chen began combing through records that had nothing to do with Melissa directly. Utility bills. Rental agreements. Bank statements. Small, seemingly meaningless details that might reveal where Larkin had been during the months after Melissa disappeared. And that's when a new timeline emerged. Just 6 weeks after Melissa Carter vanished, Larkin had taken an unexpected trip. The transaction appeared quietly in his bank records. A gas station purchase, then another, then a motel charge nearly 200 miles north of the town where Melissa lived. The trip lasted only 1 night. The following morning he returned home. There was nothing illegal about it. But the timing was unsettling. People sometimes travel after committing a crime. Not to escape. But to get rid of something. Something heavy. Something permanent. Chen requested satellite imagery of the region where Larkin had spent that night. It was a remote stretch of land filled with dense forest, abandoned logging roads, and miles of terrain where a person could disappear without leaving a trace. Search teams had already combed the wooded hills 20 miles outside town where Melissa's torn blouse was found. But this area was much farther away. Much quieter. And far less likely to be searched by accident. Detectives debated whether the trip meant anything at all. Then another discovery made the possibility harder to ignore. The motel where Larkin stayed that night still had records. Old paper logs stored in a back office. The owner, an elderly man who had run the place for decades, allowed investigators to review them. Most of the entries were ordinary, truck drivers passing through, travelers stopping for the night. But one detail stood out. Larkin had checked in late. After 11:40 p.m. And when the clerk asked how many people were staying in the room, Larkin answered quickly. Just me. The clerk remembered something else, too. Not clearly. Just a faint impression that lingered in his memory when detectives showed him Larkin's photograph. He seemed nervous, the man said. Not panicked. But restless. Like someone who didn't plan to sleep much. Larkin left the motel early the next morning. Before sunrise. No one saw where he went afterward. The information alone was not enough to justify a search of the surrounding forest. The area covered hundreds of square miles. Without a specific location, investigators would be wandering blindly. Still, Detective Mills felt the old unease return. For years he had believed the truth was hiding somewhere near Redwood Lane. Now it felt like the story might stretch far beyond the quiet neighborhood where Melissa had disappeared. And then another strange piece of the puzzle appeared. While examining vehicle service records from Larkin's old auto shop, detectives found a maintenance log dated just days after Melissa vanished. It recorded a repair on Larkin's pickup truck. The note was brief. Interior cleaning. Carpet replaced. The repair had been performed at his own shop. No receipts. No outside witnesses. Just a line scribbled in a mechanic's handwriting. Detectives stared at the record for a long time. Carpet replaced. That wasn't something people usually did unless the original material was badly damaged. Or stained. Forensic specialists explained the possibility quietly. Blood can soak deep into fabric and padding. Even after surface cleaning, traces often remain trapped beneath the fibers. Replacing the carpet entirely would eliminate that evidence. If someone knew what they were doing. Someone like a mechanic with access to tools, cleaning chemicals, and time alone in a garage. The theory was chilling. If Melissa had been forced into the truck that night. If she had been injured or struggling. The interior might have carried the evidence investigators were searching for. But by the time the possibility surfaced, the truck was long gone. Destroyed in a highway accident years earlier. The physical truth, if it ever existed there, had vanished with it. Still, patterns were forming. A man who followed her. A man who called repeatedly. A man who owned a truck seen leaving the street at the exact time she disappeared. A man who replaced the interior carpet days later. And a man who took a quiet trip deep into the forest 6 weeks after the crime. Yet even now, investigators could not place him inside Melissa's house. They could not prove he was the one who knocked on the door. And without that moment, without the exact point where the crime began, the entire case remained a theory. The years continued passing. The Carter file slowly thickened with new reports, new interviews, new maps of possible locations where Melissa's remains might lie. But no matter how carefully the investigation expanded, it always returned to the same fragile center. 19 minutes. From 2:11 a.m., when Melissa answered the final phone call, to 2:30 a.m., when a truck rolled slowly away from Redwood Lane under the yellow glow of a street lamp. 19 minutes in which a quiet home became the scene of a vanishing. 19 minutes in which a woman's life ended or changed forever. And somewhere within those silent moments, the truth existed. Not as speculation. Not as suspicion. But as a memory carried by someone who had never spoken about it. Someone who still lived freely, waking up every morning knowing that the secret remained hidden. But secrets have a strange weight. They grow heavier over time. And the deeper investigators pushed into David Larkin's past, the more it began to feel like that weight was pressing somewhere beneath the surface of the story. Because somewhere out there, beyond the quiet streets, beyond the wooded hills, beyond the motel where Larkin spent that uneasy night, Melissa Carter was still missing. And the ground beneath California held more than one place where the truth might be buried. Waiting. Silent. Until the day someone finally stepped in the exact spot where the past had been hidden. The Carter case had now stretched across 5 long years, and time had done what time always does. It blurred the edges of memory. Witnesses grew uncertain. Details once described with confidence became hesitant guesses. The neighbor who saw the truck on Redwood Lane could no longer swear whether it had been dark green or black. Another resident, who once believed they heard a vehicle engine late that night, now wondered if it might have been something else entirely. Memory fades. Evidence disappears. But sometimes time does the opposite. Sometimes time exposes something that was hidden all along. In late 2008, a quiet development inside the state crime lab began reshaping investigations across California. Forensic scientists were experimenting with new DNA recovery techniques designed to extract genetic material from extremely small or degraded samples, evidence that would have been considered useless just a few years earlier. Detective Laura Chen immediately thought about the Carter case. Specifically, the tiny drop of blood investigators had discovered in Melissa's hallway months after her disappearance. At the time, the lab confirmed the blood belonged to Melissa Carter, but the sample had been too small and too contaminated to reveal anything else. Any secondary DNA, skin cells from another person, microscopic traces left during a struggle, had been impossible to isolate. Now, with the newer technology, that possibility had changed. Chen submitted the evidence again. The sample had been sealed carefully for years, preserved inside the department's evidence storage under controlled conditions. Forensic technicians began the delicate process of re-examining it under the new protocols. The wait lasted nearly 2 months. When the lab finally called, Chen and Detective Mills drove to the facility together. The lead forensic analyst greeted them with a careful expression, neither excitement nor disappointment. Just caution. We were able to recover additional DNA, she said. Mills leaned forward slightly. From the blood? Yes. But then the analyst added something that shifted the entire room. The secondary DNA is partial. Not a complete profile. Not enough for a direct match in national criminal databases. But enough to establish something crucial. The genetic markers belonged to a male contributor. Someone else had been present during the moment when that blood drop fell to the hallway carpet. The discovery sent a shock through the investigation. 4 years detectives had suspected Melissa struggled with someone near the front door. Now, for the first time, science confirmed that another person had physically interacted with her in that exact space. But the result carried both hope and frustration. The partial DNA profile could not yet identify the person. Unless investigators had a sample to compare it with. Which meant detectives needed something they had never obtained before. David Larkin's DNA. Obtaining it legally would not be easy. Larkin had never been arrested. He had no criminal record that would require him to submit a DNA sample. And without probable cause, investigators could not simply demand one. But there was another way. Sometimes suspects provide DNA without realizing it. A discarded coffee cup. A cigarette. A bottle. Anything carrying saliva. Detectives began quietly watching Larkin's routine. By now, he lived in a small town nearly 3 hours away from the place where Melissa Carter vanished. He worked at another automotive garage, living in a modest apartment above a grocery store parking lot. From the outside, his life looked unremarkable. Routine. Predictable. Every weekday morning he stopped at the same coffee stand on his way to work. Black coffee. Paper cup. No lid. Detectives waited patiently. One morning, after Larkin tossed the empty cup into a public trash bin beside the parking lot, an undercover officer retrieved it minutes later. The cup was sealed immediately and sent to the crime lab. Forensic analysts extracted the DNA. Then they compared it to the partial profile recovered from Melissa Carter's hallway. The results took 3 weeks. 3 long weeks, during which the entire investigation felt suspended in silence. Then the lab report arrived. Detective Chen read the document slowly. Every line. Every marker. Then she looked up at Mills. The partial DNA recovered from the hallway could not exclude David Larkin as the contributor. It wasn't a definitive match. The sample was too incomplete for that. But the statistical probability of another unrelated person sharing those same genetic markers was extremely low. In other words, the science didn't prove Larkin was there. But it suggested strongly that he could have been. The room inside the police department filled with quiet tension when the results were presented. Some detectives felt the case was finally breaking open. Others warned that the evidence was still too fragile for a courtroom. Defense attorneys could easily argue contamination. Coincidence. Incomplete science. Still, the partial match changed the dynamics of the investigation in a way nothing else had before. Because now, for the first time, detectives could say something with confidence. A man's DNA was present during the moment Melissa Carter was injured in her hallway. And David Larkin could not be ruled out as that man. The district attorney reviewed the case carefully. The evidence was compelling. But still circumstantial. Without a body. Without a witness. Without a confession. Prosecutors believed the case might collapse under cross-examination. So the investigation continued. Detectives returned once more to the wooded area where Melissa's torn blouse had been discovered years earlier. New search teams combed the terrain, with advanced ground-penetrating radar equipment designed to detect disturbances in soil layers. The forest had grown thicker since the first search. Trees taller. Brush heavier. Time had done its best to hide whatever might lie beneath. For days, investigators walked the hills in slow, methodical lines. Scanning. Digging. Checking every anomaly the radar detected. Most of the signals turned out to be nothing. Old tree roots. Animal burrows. Rocks. But on the 4th day of the search, one reading stopped the team in their tracks. A rectangular disturbance beneath the soil. Roughly 6 feet long. 3 feet wide. The size of something deliberately buried. The excavation began carefully. Shovels cutting through layers of dry earth. Every movement slow. Precise. Detectives watched from the edge of the clearing as the hole deepened. A foot. 2 feet. 3. The air grew quiet. Because everyone standing there knew what they might find. Or what they desperately hoped to find. At 4 feet deep, the shovel struck something solid. Not rock. Not wood. Plastic. The search team froze. A corner of black plastic emerged from the soil. Thick. Wrapped tightly. The kind of heavy-duty material used for construction, or large trash bags. Carefully, investigators cleared the surrounding dirt. The shape beneath the plastic looked unmistakable. Human. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the final layer of soil was brushed away. Because after 5 years of searching, after 5 years of unanswered questions, detectives were staring at the first real possibility that Melissa Carter might finally be found. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, David Larkin was still living his ordinary life. Unaware that deep in the California hills, the ground had just begun to reveal what it had been hiding since the night Melissa Carter disappeared. The interrogation room was quiet except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Detectives placed a thick folder on the table between them and Mark Jensen. Inside were photographs, reports, and the final piece of evidence they had waited decades to obtain. The DNA report. Detective Alvarez slowly opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Your DNA, he said calmly, was found under Sarah Miller's fingernails. For the first time since the interview began, Jensen's composure cracked. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked down to the document and then back up at the detectives. The confident, relaxed posture he had maintained for hours suddenly stiffened. That's impossible, he muttered. But the detectives had heard that sentence many times before. Alvarez leaned forward slightly. It's not impossible, he said. It's science. The new test, performed using advanced forensic technology unavailable in 2003, had extracted a complete DNA profile from microscopic skin cells preserved on the victim's evidence samples. Those cells matched Jensen with overwhelming statistical certainty. For years, the evidence had sat quietly in a climate-controlled locker, waiting for technology to catch up. Now it had. Jensen shifted in his chair, his breathing slightly heavier. Detective Cole placed another photo on the table. It was a crime scene image from that summer night, the wooded trail behind the apartment complex where Sarah's body had been discovered. Remember this place? Cole asked. Jensen stared at the photograph, but said nothing. Investigators had spent months reconstructing Jensen's movements in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance. Phone records placed him near her apartment that evening. Witnesses recalled seeing his truck in the parking lot. Back in 2003, those details had seemed circumstantial. Now they were part of a much larger picture. Alvarez slid one more item across the table. A photograph of Jensen and Sarah taken at a community barbecue weeks before the murder. You told investigators you barely knew her, Alvarez said. Jensen's silence stretched across the room. The detectives waited. Interrogations often worked like pressure chambers. The evidence was the rising weight, slowly squeezing the truth out of a suspect who realized the walls were closing in. After several minutes, Jensen rubbed his hands together nervously. This doesn't prove anything, he said. But his voice lacked conviction. Cole leaned back in his chair. Mark, he said quietly, you've lived with this for 20 years. Another long silence followed. Outside the room, investigators watched through the one-way glass. The tension was thick. Inside, Jensen finally exhaled slowly. He looked down at the DNA report again. Then he spoke. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The room went completely still. Detective Alvarez exchanged a quick glance with Cole. After 2 decades of unanswered questions, the truth was finally beginning to surface. Jensen described that night in fragments. He admitted he had gone to Sarah's apartment after a local party. He said they argued about rumors circulating in the community, about something Sarah had threatened to reveal. The argument escalated. What happened next, he claimed, was a moment of rage. But the evidence suggested something darker. Investigators believed the attack had been deliberate. Sarah had fought desperately, leaving behind the tiny pieces of evidence that would eventually expose her killer. Evidence that had waited patiently for 2 decades. When Jensen finished speaking, the room was silent again. Detective Cole closed the folder. "Mark Jensen," he said, "you are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Miller." Handcuffs clicked into place. Outside the station, the news spread quickly through the small Minnesota community. For 20 years, residents had wondered what happened to the young woman whose life ended on a quiet summer night. Now they finally had an answer. But for Sarah's family, the arrest was only the beginning. Because justice delayed for decades still leaves scars that never fully heal. And as the case moved toward trial, the courtroom would soon reveal even more disturbing details about the night that had haunted an entire town. Part 10 will reveal the courtroom battle and the final verdict. The courtroom was already packed long before the trial officially began. Reporters lined the back rows, notebooks ready. Cameras waited outside the courthouse doors. For the first time in 20 years, the murder of Sarah Miller was no longer a fading memory in police archives. It was headline news again. At the front of the courtroom sat Sarah's family. Her parents looked older now, their hair gray, their faces lined with the weight of 2 decades of unanswered questions. Beside them sat Sarah's younger sister, who had been only a teenager when the tragedy happened. They had spent half their lives waiting for this moment. Across the room sat Mark Jensen. The once confident man from the interrogation room now appeared smaller, quieter. Wearing a dark suit, he avoided looking toward Sarah's family. The prosecution wasted no time. Their case centered on one powerful element, the DNA evidence. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury and held up a small plastic evidence bag. "Inside this bag," she said, "are the microscopic skin cells found beneath Sarah Miller's fingernails the night she died." She paused. For 20 years, this evidence waited. The courtroom was silent. When investigators first collected these samples in 2003, the technology simply did not exist to fully identify the person responsible. But science advanced. And when the evidence was retested in 2023, the DNA profile pointed to one man. She turned slowly toward the defense table. "Mark Jensen." The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of the new testing methods. They argued that the evidence had been stored for decades and could have been contaminated. But the forensic expert, who took the stand, dismantled that argument piece by piece. The samples had been carefully preserved. The testing procedures were verified multiple times. And the probability that the DNA belonged to anyone other than Jensen was nearly impossible. One juror leaned forward as the expert explained the results. Statistically, the scientist said, the chance that the DNA belongs to someone else is less than 1 in several trillion. The number hung heavily in the air. But the most emotional moment came when Sarah's sister took the witness stand. Her voice trembled as she described the last time she saw Sarah alive, laughing in the kitchen, talking about plans for the future. "We waited 20 years, she told the jury. 20 years wondering who took her away from us." She turned slightly toward Jensen. "And why?" The defense chose not to have Jensen testify. Instead, they tried to suggest that his earlier statements during interrogation had been misunderstood or taken out of context. But prosecutors played portions of the recorded interview. The jury listened as Jensen's voice echoed through the courtroom. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The words carried enormous weight. Over several days, investigators reconstructed the events of that summer night in chilling detail, the argument, the struggle, and the desperate attempt to hide the crime. By the time closing arguments arrived, the case felt inevitable. The prosecutor looked directly at the jury. For 20 years, she said, Sarah Miller could not speak. She gestured toward the evidence displayed before them. But the evidence speaks for her. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom filled with a tense silence. The foreperson stood. The judge asked the question everyone had been waiting to hear. On the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find the defendant? The answer came clearly. Guilty. Sarah's mother began to cry softly. Across the room, Mark Jensen remained motionless, as the verdict echoed through the courtroom. The judge later sentenced him to decades in prison, a punishment that would likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. For the investigators who had reopened the case, the verdict represented something rare in criminal justice. A cold case solved. Evidence preserved. And a victim who finally received justice. Outside the courthouse, snow began to fall across the small Minnesota town, just as it had during the winter when detectives first reopened the investigation. 20 years had passed. But the truth, buried in a microscopic trace of DNA, had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting to be found. The verdict should have ended the story. A courtroom decision. A guilty man in handcuffs. A 20-year mystery finally closed. That is how cold cases usually end. But the night after the verdict, Detective Alan Ruiz sat alone in his office staring at the evidence board that had dominated his life for nearly 2 years. Every photo was still there. Sarah Miller smiling in a graduation picture. The crime scene photographs. The map of the neighborhood. And the thin red string connecting it all. Most detectives would have taken it down the moment the jury spoke. Ruiz didn't. Because something about the case still bothered him. Not the DNA. Not the timeline. Those pieces were solid. What haunted him was something smaller, something quieter, something the jury never saw. A phone call. Late in the investigation, months before Jensen's arrest, Ruiz had reviewed the original police logs from 2003 again. Page after page of routine reports. Patrol notes. Witness statements. Dispatch transcripts. Buried inside the stack was a single record that almost no one noticed. A call placed to 911 at 11:47 p.m. the night Sarah died. It came from a payphone 3 blocks away from the creek. The message lasted only 7 seconds. A male voice. Whispering. She's in the water. Then the line disconnected. At the time, officers assumed it was a prank, or a panicked bystander, who didn't want to get involved. The payphone had been checked. No one was there. No fingerprints were recovered. And the call was forgotten. But Ruiz never forgot it. Because when he replayed the recording months later, something strange happened. The voice sounded familiar. Not clearly enough to prove anything. But familiar. Ruiz had listened to hundreds of hours of interrogation recordings from Mark Jensen. He knew Jensen's voice. The rhythm. The slight nasal tone. The way certain words stretched longer than others. The whisper on that 911 call had the same rhythm. But the audio quality was terrible. Too distorted for official comparison. Too weak to use in court. And so the call never became part of the trial. The jury never heard it. But Ruiz kept thinking about it. Because if Jensen made that call, it meant something chilling. It meant the killer stood close enough to the creek to see the body in the water. And it meant he called police immediately after leaving the scene. Why? Ruiz leaned back in his chair and stared at the wall. Most killers run. They disappear. They hide. But sometimes they can't resist watching what happens next. And that possibility led Ruiz back to another detail that still felt unfinished. The timeline. According to prosecutors, Sarah died sometime between 10:30 and 11:15 p.m. Her body was discovered the next morning by a jogger. But if Jensen called police at 11:47, that meant he was still nearby nearly half an hour after the attack. Standing somewhere in the darkness. Watching the creek. Watching the water carry away the evidence. Ruiz rubbed his eyes. Maybe the verdict had simply made him restless. Detectives often feel that way after a long case ends. The adrenaline disappears. The silence sets in. But 2 days later, another detail surfaced. And suddenly the case felt unfinished again. A journalist from Sacramento contacted the police department asking about the investigation. That part wasn't unusual. What caught Ruiz's attention was the question she asked. Was anyone else ever considered a suspect? Ruiz replied the way investigators always do. All leads were investigated. But the journalist wasn't finished. She mentioned a name Ruiz hadn't heard during the entire trial. A man named Kevin Doyle. Ruiz pulled the original witness list. There it was. Kevin Doyle. Interviewed once in 2003. Then never again. According to the file, Doyle had been walking his dog near the park the night Sarah disappeared. He told police he saw a dark sedan leaving the area around 11:30 p.m. At the time, detectives assumed it was unrelated. Hundreds of cars passed through that neighborhood every night. The sighting went nowhere. But the journalist had discovered something new. Kevin Doyle had moved away from the town shortly after the murder. Not unusual. People move all the time. But 3 years later, Doyle was arrested in Oregon. For assault. The victim was a woman he knew. The case ended in a plea deal. And Doyle disappeared again. Ruiz leaned closer to the phone. "Why are you asking about him now?" he said. The journalist hesitated. Then she said something that made Ruiz sit upright. "Because Kevin Doyle just contacted me." Ruiz felt a chill. "What did he say?" Another pause. Then the journalist spoke quietly. "He said the police arrested the wrong man." The office suddenly felt colder. Ruiz had spent years chasing the truth in the Miller case. DNA evidence. Witness testimony. Confession-like statements. A guilty verdict. Everything pointed to Mark Jensen. And yet now, weeks after the trial ended, a man from the original investigation was suddenly resurfacing, claiming the killer was someone else. Ruiz didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked back to the evidence board. Sarah Miller's photo stared back at him from the center. For 20 years the town had lived with uncertainty. Then science delivered an answer. But now, a new question had arrived. Quiet. Uninvited. And impossible to ignore. Because cold cases have a strange way of refusing to stay buried. Even after a courtroom says they're over. Even after a killer is locked behind steel bars. Sometimes the truth keeps moving. Like water in a dark creek. Silent. Restless. Waiting for someone to notice the current. And Detective Alan Ruiz suddenly felt that current again. Pulling him back into the shadows of a case the world believed was already solved. 3 days after the phone call with the journalist, Detective Alan Ruiz reopened the storage box. Technically, the case was closed. The court had ruled. The verdict had been delivered. Mark Jensen was already being processed into the California state prison system. But Ruiz had spent too many years working homicide to believe that every story ended cleanly. Some cases closed like a door. Others creaked open again. The evidence room smelled faintly of cardboard and old paper. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Ruiz slid the Miller case box across the metal table. 2 decades of investigation sat inside. Crime scene photographs. Interview transcripts. Old cassette recordings. The original detective's notes from 2003. Ruiz began flipping through the files again, slower this time, looking for anything connected to the name Kevin Doyle. Most of the pages were routine. Witness statements. Patrol logs. Nothing unusual. Then he found it. A short interview report dated July 18, 2003, 12:40 a.m. Kevin Doyle had spoken to officers less than 2 hours after Sarah's body was discovered. The statement was brief. Doyle claimed he had been walking his dog along the park path late that night when he saw a dark sedan leaving the parking area near the creek. The vehicle drove away quickly. Too quickly, Doyle said. When officers asked if he saw the driver, he answered no. When asked for a description of the car, he hesitated. Maybe a Ford or something similar. Then the report ended. The original detectives apparently saw nothing suspicious. Just another witness offering vague details. But Ruiz noticed something the earlier investigators never mentioned. Kevin Doyle lived only 2 blocks from the creek. Which meant he wasn't just a random passerby. He was part of the neighborhood. Ruiz leaned back in his chair. 2 blocks away meant Doyle could have heard police sirens that night. Could have seen the flashing lights. Could have walked over to watch the investigation, like dozens of curious neighbors had done. Yet his statement said nothing about seeing the body or the officers. Only the car. And Ruiz suddenly wondered something simple, but unsettling. How did Doyle know the car was leaving the parking area if he wasn't already there? The thought lingered in the quiet room. Detectives learned to recognize that feeling. That tiny shift in the story. A detail that doesn't quite line up. Ruiz pulled Doyle's contact information from the file. The phone number listed in 2003 was long disconnected. The address belonged to someone else now. But the journalist had said Doyle contacted her. Which meant he wanted to be found. Ruiz called her again that afternoon. Did he say where he is? Ruiz asked. Portland, she replied. At least that's what he claimed. Did he explain why he thinks Jensen is innocent? The journalist hesitated. Not exactly. What do you mean? He kept repeating one thing. Ruiz waited. He said the killer didn't leave in a car. Ruiz felt a tightening in his chest. Those were his exact words. Yes. The detective stared at the evidence board across his office wall. Because Doyle's original statement, the one given in 2003, specifically described a car leaving the scene. A dark sedan. But now Doyle was claiming the opposite. The killer didn't leave in a car. The contradiction sat there like a crack in glass. Small. But impossible to ignore. Ruiz drove home late that night, the city lights blurring past his windshield. Every homicide detective knows the same rule. People misremember details all the time. Especially after 20 years. But sometimes memory doesn't change by accident. Sometimes people change their stories because the truth is catching up to them. The next morning Ruiz sat down with the original case timeline again. 10:30 p.m. Sarah Miller last seen leaving a friend's house. 10:45 p.m. Possible argument near the creek, according to a distant witness. 11:15 p.m. Estimated time of death. 11:47 p.m. Anonymous 911 call from a payphone. She's in the water. Ruiz stared at the final entry. Then he added something new beneath it. Unknown witness statement, Kevin Doyle, claims vehicle leaving scene. Then another note. 2023 interview, Doyle claims killer did not leave in vehicle. Two versions. One witness. Two completely different accounts. Ruiz rubbed his temples. If Doyle had simply misremembered the car, that would be one thing. But if Doyle knew the killer didn't leave in a car, that meant something very different. It meant he may have seen the killer leave on foot. Or worse. It meant he may have known the killer personally. Outside the station, rain began falling across the city streets. The same cold California rain that had soaked the park the night Sarah died. Ruiz suddenly remembered another detail from the evidence photos. A set of partial shoe impressions near the creek bank. Too damaged to identify. Too blurred to match to anyone. The prints had always been considered useless. But now Ruiz wondered if they told a different story. A story where someone didn't drive away from the scene. A story where someone simply walked home. 2 blocks. Through dark streets. Past quiet houses. Into a neighborhood that would sleep through the crime. Ruiz stood up slowly. Because for the first time since the trial ended, the case no longer felt finished. It felt alive again. And somewhere in Portland, Oregon, a man named Kevin Doyle had just reopened a door that should have stayed closed. A door leading back to a summer night in 2003. Back to the creek. Back to the water. Back to the moment when someone left Sarah Miller there in the darkness. And walked away. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. Cold sheets of water swept across the city, rattling against the windows of the homicide division as Detective Alan Ruiz stared once again at the name that refused to leave his mind. Kevin Doyle. A man who appeared briefly in the original investigation. A witness. Nothing more. And yet now, 20 years later, he was suddenly pushing himself back into the story. Ruiz had seen this pattern before. People connected to violent crimes sometimes disappear into silence for decades. Then something changes. A guilty conscience. A drinking problem. A late-night conversation that slips too far. Or the simple realization that the past isn't as buried as they once believed. Ruiz printed every record he could find connected to Doyle. The stack wasn't large. A driver's license history. Rental addresses. Employment records scattered across 3 states. But one document stood out immediately. The assault charge in Oregon. Filed in 2006. Ruiz opened the report slowly. The victim was a woman Doyle had been dating for several months. According to the statement, the argument began inside Doyle's apartment late at night. Neighbors later told police they heard shouting and something breaking. Then silence. When officers arrived, The woman was sitting on the floor in the hallway outside Doyle's apartment. Her lip was split. Her arm bruised. But the detail that caught Ruiz's attention wasn't the injury. It was the description of Doyle's behavior. The responding officer wrote that Doyle seemed calm, detached, even polite. Almost too calm. When the officer asked Doyle what happened, Doyle gave a simple answer. She slipped. The victim later admitted they had been fighting. But she refused to testify in court. The case ended with a reduced charge and probation. Another file closed. Another violent moment buried under paperwork. Ruiz leaned back in his chair. Violence rarely appears out of nowhere. It leaves fingerprints in a person's history. Patterns. Small eruptions that hint at something darker underneath. And now Ruiz wondered if Kevin Doyle's history had started much earlier than 2006. He opened the original Miller case interview again. The words were simple. Almost casual. Walking dog. Saw car leaving park around 11:30. Didn't see driver. Ruiz stared at the line for a long time. Then he noticed something subtle. The interview had lasted exactly 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That was all the original detectives spent speaking with Doyle. In a murder investigation. Ruiz shook his head slowly. Back in 2003 the case had been chaos. Hundreds of tips. Dozens of witnesses. Police overwhelmed by media pressure and community fear. In that storm of information, some details inevitably slipped through the cracks. And maybe Kevin Doyle had been one of them. Later that evening Ruiz called the journalist again. Did Doyle contact you directly? He asked. Yes. How? Email. Ruiz felt his pulse quicken slightly. Do you still have it? Of course. She forwarded the message within minutes. Ruiz opened the email. The text was short. Only 3 sentences. But each one felt deliberate. You wrote about the Miller case. You should know something important. The police arrested the wrong man. The killer didn't drive away that night. No signature. No explanation. Just those 3 lines. Ruiz read the email again. Then again. The words felt calculated. Careful. Not emotional. Not panicked. Almost testing. As if Doyle wanted to see how the story would react. As if he wanted to watch the investigation breathe again. Ruiz forwarded the email to the department's cyber unit. They traced the message within an hour. It came from a public library in Portland. Sent at 2:13 p.m. No camera footage available. Whoever sent it knew exactly how to avoid leaving a digital trail. That detail didn't comfort Ruiz. It made him more suspicious. Because innocent witnesses rarely hide. But people with secrets often do. The next morning Ruiz presented everything to his captain. The response was immediate and predictable. The case is closed, the captain said. We have a conviction. Yes, Ruiz replied. But we also have a witness changing his story 20 years later. The captain sighed. You think he's involved? I don't know yet. You have any evidence Jensen isn't the killer? Ruiz hesitated. No. Then what are we doing here? Ruiz glanced down at the printed email. Because something about the message kept circling his thoughts. The killer didn't drive away that night. Not I didn't see a car. Not maybe the car was unrelated. No. Doyle's words were precise. Certain. The killer didn't drive away. That wasn't a guess. That was a statement of fact. Ruiz finally looked up. I think Doyle knows something he never told police. The captain studied him quietly. Or, Ruiz continued, he's trying to insert himself into the story for attention. Both possibilities existed. Both had happened before in other investigations. But the captain knew Ruiz well enough to recognize that look in his eyes. Detectives develop instincts the longer they work homicide. A quiet sense that something in the narrative is off. A thread hanging loose in an otherwise tight knot. The captain exhaled slowly. You want to fly to Portland? Ruiz didn't answer. He didn't need to. The captain leaned back in his chair. This doesn't reopen the case officially, he said. You understand that? Ruiz nodded. You're just following up on a witness. Understood. The captain signed the travel authorization. Ruiz picked up the paper without saying another word. Outside the station, the rain had finally stopped. Clouds drifted slowly across the pale California sky. For most of the world, the Miller case was finished. A solved cold case. A killer behind bars. A community finally at peace. But somewhere in Portland, a man named Kevin Doyle had just whispered something into the past. And Detective Alan Ruiz was about to find out why. Because sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't buried in evidence. They are buried in people. And when those people start talking, old cases can begin to breathe again.